Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining tonight's virtual forum event hosted by the Institute of Politics and Public Service at the McCourt School of Public Policy, known to many of you as GU Politics. My name is Jenny Patterson, and I am a Master's of Public Policy student, class of 2021, where I am studying politics and social policy. Throughout my time at Georgetown, I've had the opportunity to serve as Director of Social Programs for the McCourt Student Association, President of the Georgetown Black Graduate Student Alliance, and member of the Women in Public Policy Initiative. I am pleased to introduce our guests tonight, Patti Solis-Doyle, a partner at Brunswick Group in Washington, D.C., and Karen Finney, a political commentator and Democratic political consultant. Patti Solis-Doyle served as Chief of Staff for Joe Biden's 2008 vice presidential campaign, and Karen Finney was Senior Advisor and Senior Spokeswoman for the 2016 Clinton campaign and vice presidential campaign. We are thrilled to have these guests with us tonight to discuss what the Biden campaign is looking for in a vice presidential pick, the role of the vice presidential candidate on the campaign trail, and their thoughts on what Joe Biden's decision may be. Please join the conversation on social media using the hashtag Veepstakes 2020 and by tagging GU Politics at GU Politics. Tonight's event will be moderated by GU Politics Executive Director Mo Lathy, who's going to kick us off.
Thanks, Jenny. Thanks for that great introduction and for your leadership at the McCourt School and at Georgetown. Thrilled to have you. And thanks to all of you for tuning in tonight. There's a lot going on in the world right now. And there's a lot of anxiety out there. But one thing, and a lot of uncertainty, but one thing we know is happening is a presidential election. And as we begin to enter the home stretch of that campaign, there's maybe no more monumental decision that people are anticipating than who the vice presidential nominee will be on the Democratic side. The Republican ticket is set, at least we think it is, and we're waiting for one more piece on the Democratic ticket. So tonight we're going to spend some time talking about that selection process, what a vice presidential campaign looks like, how a presidential campaign selects the nominee's running mate, and then maybe spend a little bit of time actually handicapping the race. We are, here's how it's gonna work. I'm gonna be talking with our guests for the first part of the evening, and then we'll open it up and let you guys here in the Zoom room ask questions. If you're a member of the Georgetown community in the Zoom chat, look at the bottom of your screen, you'll see the Q&A tab. Click on that to submit your question. That is open now. It will be open throughout the entire program, so you can even start submitting your questions now. And then when it is time, when a member of our staff selects you, they'll let you know in the chat. And then when we're ready to bring you up on screen, as they say in the business, be broadcast ready, because we're gonna make you famous and put you on camera to ask your question of our guests directly. I think that's all my housekeeping stuff. So we'll move to the conversation. And I'm really excited to be joined by Patti and Karen, both of whom I've known for a long time, both of whom have been colleagues of mine. Patti was my boss in 2008 on Hillary Clinton's first presidential campaign. Karen was a colleague on that campaign. Karen was one of my mentors, one of my predecessors as the DNC communications director. Both have tremendous amount of experience in Democratic politics at the presidential and for tonight's purposes, especially the vice presidential level. So I'm excited to dive right in. So, you know, one of the things, I want to start process, Patti and Karen. One of the things, as I was chatting with some folks a couple days ago about this event that surprised them was that, you know, you were both hired on the vice presidential campaign without knowing who the vice presidential nominee was going to be. And I'm kind of curious, let's start there and then work our way over to the selection process. But Patti, you were chief of staff to the 2008 Democratic vice presidential campaign before Joe Biden was selected. Talk a little bit about what that's like to actually have to build a campaign apparatus without knowing who your candidate is and how you did so.
First of all, Mo, thank you so much for having me. Thank you, Georgetown. I love you guys. You guys do such incredible programming and content for students and for, you know, political hacks and people who are interested in politics. So thank you. It was bizarre. I want to say, although I'm not sure, that the Obama campaign was the first to do it that way. My prior experience on presidential campaigns, the VP was selected, and along with that VP came their staff, right? The people that they are comfortable with and have worked with in the past. When I arrived on the Obama campaign, David Plouffe offered me a role in the campaign and offered a couple of different roles. And I chose VP operations only because I had come from working on Hillary's campaign. And as maybe some of you know that Hillary and Obama had quite the battle royale in 2008. And there were some sort of, between staff members once the nominee was chosen, there were still some sore feelings. I thought that the operations, I could at least have my own fee rather than being integrated in the overall campaign. I plus like, nope, this is going.
Did we lose Patti?
I think we might have.
All right. Well, hopefully Patti can rejoin us.
Yeah.
Maybe someone from the team can text her. You were in a very similar situation, weren't you, Karen? Talk a little bit about what it was like. You came in. You had been already on the campaign, the 2016 campaign from the beginning, and got asked to work as the communications director for the vice presidential candidate before that happened.
Yeah, I mean, so I had been in the Clinton campaign, and around the timing when the vice presidential selection process starts, which I know we'll get into a little bit more later, but there's a list of people, and and it was sort of known that, and I've actually counseled some of the people who are up this time, be prepared. You don't get to bring your whole staff, actually. You may get one or two people. And in fact, with Senator Kaine, that's exactly what happened. But there was this period before I started officially on the VP side where it was between a handful of people, and, we were sort of, I kind of had who I thought would be good, but just sort of figured, well, I like all of them. I could work for any of them. So, and you just kind of leave the decision because ultimately the presidential candidate makes that decision. So I knew it was going to be working for someone. I just didn't know who it was going to be. I knew, roughly between a couple of people. And so, you are then, introduced. I had actually known Senator Kaine, as you may recall, Mo, because I'd been the communications director of the DNC throughout the 2008 cycle, and I stayed on for a few months in 2009 when he became the head of the DNC. So I'd known him a little bit, but essentially our team he had one person who traveled with him on the plane, a guy named Mike Henry, who was his guy. He had one person who came from his Senate office and was at the headquarters in Brooklyn. And then he had, a handful of totally new people traveling with him and working with him. And there's a little bit of getting to know each other, getting to know, and as you all know, in communications in particular, but, you're getting to know your candidate and getting to know their style. But then sort of how do you blend that with what the campaign talking points are, what the campaign mission is, because really the vice presidential nominee is someone who is meant to be the chief surrogate, if you will, for the campaign, next to obviously the candidate themselves. And so making and helping that person understand very quickly, because most of these folks go from, being a senator, perhaps a governor, to the Klieg lights of the national spotlight. So it's also really helping them navigate that. They have a traveling press corps. Many of them have never had that, and helping them understand what those rules are going to be, and having to do press availabilities, and sort of, they sort of step into this operation that is up and running, and that has really been up and running for quite some time. And it's like 0 to 60 in, an hour, basically. And so you've got to help that person really hit the ground running. And also the last thing I would say is remember that timing wise, given that the vice presidential nominee is named, around the time of the convention, so fairly late in the, in the summer, there's no room for error. That person doesn't have the same kind of leeway that a candidate does when they've been through a primary and the, you know, the throes of the general. They really have to hit the ground, firing on all cylinders, working, as I say many times, with new people, and make no mistake. And it is just a sprint to the end.
Patti,
I'm back. Sorry, guys.
Yeah. Talk a little bit as the head of the vice presidential operations in 2008, what it was like to construct the whole thing. I mean, to Karen's point, right? Like,
right.
Joe Biden gets selected as the running mate, and he comes into a team that's been waiting and ready and already has the beginnings of a schedule in place and knows kind of the strategy. He's used to being the principal for his long record. Now he's, as Karen put it, the surrogate.
Right.
Talk a little bit about that integration and what, how you guys approach building a vice presidential campaign in the home stretch of the campaign.
Right. So I was hired about a month before the actual selection. I was tasked to hire the entire team. We were not expecting to allow whoever was selected to bring anybody on their staff on board. So I was to hire a press secretary, a communications director, a traveling aide, a policy director, a speech writer, the whole shebang. It was about a 20-person team. So I spent the first couple of weeks doing that, and that is, as Karen mentioned, you need people who know what they're doing, who have presidential campaign experience, because as she said, this poor person has to go from 0 to 60 overnight, truly, literally overnight. They get told it's going to be you, and then the next morning they're announced. So they have to be ready to go. We had a short list of 4 people. And truly, I did not know until about 3 days before they actually selected who it was going to be. So we did 4 separate rollouts, 4 separate announcement speeches, 4 separate where we're going to announce this, the VP, 4 separate media rollouts, 4 separate first interview. It was a mammoth amount of work. But that's why Pluff really wanted me to start a good month before Joe was selected. And then Karen's right. You know, here we are. We fly. David Axelrod and I flew in the dark of night the night before to brief him in the morning on his announcement day. And there he is, met with an entirely new team of people that he doesn't know very well. He's not comfortable. And this is probably the biggest political moment of his life. And he's seeing people, he's trusting people he's never really worked with before. I mean, I knew Joe Biden. I had worked with him very, very briefly, but still, he didn't know me from Adam. And so there's this level of trust that needs to be almost immediate. And then I think for Joe specifically, it was very much, okay, clearly you all know what you're doing. You won the nomination. This is a Barack Obama who went from being a senator, a first-term senator, to the nominee of the Democratic Party. But if we win, then the deal is this is going to be a full partnership. So I think he was very comfortable with, I'll leave the politics to you. You guys know what you're doing. But when it comes to governing, then we got to talk.
Let's talk about the selection process, because throughout history, there have been a lot of different presidential nominees have picked their running mate for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes it is the electoral might play a heavier role. In other cases, it is thinking about a partnership in governing a little bit more. Talk about, from both of your experiences in 2008 and in 2016, how the decision was made, to the extent that you can share that, how the decision was made and what you think generally Joe Biden is thinking about and his selection team is thinking about.
Well, can I go back to the 1992 campaign, which, of course, Patti and I were both in kindergarten when we worked on that one, as you may recall. You know, that was I just mentioned that because that was really, I think, if I'm not mistaken, one of the first times that a vice presidential nominee made it very clear to the presidential nominee, this has got to be a full partnership. If I'm going to do this, I'm not just going to, go to funerals and do, kind of ribbon cuttings. And as you may recall, it was very controversial because people said 2 young men from the South, it's not going to work. From the electoral perspective, people, there were other people's names that had been mentioned, and it worked. So the one of the positives on that is that to some degree, while the Electoral College obviously is critically important, and it is something that we had a problem with, obviously in 2016 on the Democratic side, you can still do something a little bit different, and it can still work. And I say that because obviously in 2020, Joe Biden is maybe on the precipice of doing something very different. In 2016, for Hillary, a lot of it was, and I think this is generally true for most of the candidates, and there were certainly people, the considerations are things like, if it's a senator or a governor from a key state where it's hard for a Democrat to win, then it's, well, if we lose that seat, if it's a Republican governor, they'll get to fill that Senate seat. Then we lose that seat in the Senate. Are they coming from a region of the country where they could help deliver a population of voters that perhaps the candidate has had trouble with? So you're thinking about a whole range of different things. In 2016 for Hillary, as part of that, it was also just the comfort level with the person and feeling like, whoever this person is, I've got to feel like if something happens to me, they could 100% be up and running, taking care of the country, as well as someone who I can talk to and bounce ideas off of and have it really be a partnership. One of the things that Biden has said that I think is really smart, and he knows, having gone through the process, which Patti can speak to, knowing that as it's such an isolating job. There aren't a lot of people you can really get down and talk turkey with, right? And who will tell you the truth. And if you choose to pick someone who does that, you want to know that person, when the door is closed, will give you their unvarnished opinion, and you would never read about it in the newspaper. And that is, so I know in 2016, that was certainly a big piece of it. The second thing I'll mention, and then I'll let Patti respond, is what does that person have that I don't have, that can balance me out? Whether that is something, as I mentioned, whether that's voters or the Electoral College, and or what will reassure voters. And to some degree, Tim Kaine, as a former governor, mayor in a southern state, Virginia was very important, but he also was someone who had broad appeal, who kind of folks thought balanced Hillary out a bit, and they had a good working relationship. So it's a whole combination of factors, and frankly, it's the presidential nominee who really has to decide what's most important to them.
Yeah, I will ditto everything that Karen said. She's absolutely right. There's so many different factors, whether it's a political factor, a governing factor, a chemistry factor. But I think that one thing, and I'm sure Joe Biden is very, very thoughtfully considering, is this time around, is this country, for lack of a better word, is in the shitter right now. I mean, between... That's
a technical political...
Yeah, yes, it's a technical word. Between the economic devastation, our healthcare system being, on the brink, not to mention things that maybe aren't on the forefront, but like education, what's going to happen to our education system? The kids who've basically lost a year of schooling, trade, immigration. This pandemic has really impacted so many things in such a pivotal way that I think what Joe Biden is looking for is someone who can actually govern and who can take some things off of his plate, much like in 2008 when Obama controversially gave Hillary Clinton the job of Secretary of State. Many of the people around him were like, what are you doing? You guys were in battle, but why would you want her around you? And his answer basically was, listen, I'm going to be really busy getting the economy back. Our relationships with the world are fragile right now. I need somebody with gravitas and who knows what they're doing, who can take that on for me. And I'm sure Joe is actually looking for a VP who can take major things on for him, because he's only one man and there's so much to do. So I think all that Karen said is absolutely right. But in this moment, we need somebody who can actually help bring the country back.
Can I mention one other thing, Mo? Yeah. I mean, most people know, right? It's changed the vetting process in a modern campaign than how we used to do campaigns, because now you've got to look through not just their financials, their, record, either, based on whatever public office they've held, their speeches, their tweets, their, anything they've done on any platform, anywhere, is fair game to be examined by the team that is basically doing the vetting. And if there are problems that arise, that's a conversation that you have with those candidates to try to see and figure out, okay, can we, as a campaign, if that becomes a hit, can we sustain that? Do we feel like we can fight that, or is that not a fight we want to have to take on? And does that maybe put someone in a position that instead of being, in the top 2, maybe they move down to a different number? That's the other piece of this that I think is interesting.
Mm-hmm.
Just a reminder to the members of the Georgetown community, the Q&A tab is open, so feel free to populate your questions. We're going to turn to your questions soon. I've got a couple more before we do, though. Look, I don't know if you guys would agree with this or not. I've always believed that, every cycle, everyone in DC and on cable news loves to sit around and talk about the electoral implications of the vice presidential pick. And my theory has been more often than not, there really aren't. The people are voting for the top of the ticket, not really voting for number 2, more often than not. But there have been a few very consequential picks, right? You mentioned 92, where Clinton's choice of Al Gore sent a very strong message about a new chapter in American history. I would actually argue that Mike Pence's selection in 2016 by Donald Trump was important to those evangelicals and diehard conservatives who really questioned Trump's bona fides there, right? They can have negative consequences. Sarah Palin in 2008 hurt John McCain far more than she helped. But I think more often than not it's fairly neutral. There are a lot of people out there who are saying that this year, Joe Biden's selection, for a number of reasons, adds some extra electoral importance. He set it up himself in large part by pledging to select a woman, which gives this a more historic feel to it in a lot of ways. But I'd love your thoughts on that, on sort of the electoral implications of Biden's pick. And then let's use that as a segue into talking about sort of the contenders. Karen, you want to start this one?
Sure. Well, I should just say outright, I was part of a group of Black women who sent a letter to Vice President Biden encouraging him and laying out the case for a Black woman vice presidential nominee. Our position was Black and female. We have said consistently that we think any of the women that whose names have been mentioned seriously would be an extraordinary pick. And one of the arguments we made, and I do think in this was a letter that we sent before George Floyd's murder and the consequences and the protests that we've seen and the movement that we've seen as a result. Part of our argument was, in terms of history, a Black woman represents the future. And we believe that, Joe Biden, having gone up against Donald Trump in 2016, you cannot take anything for granted. And that Biden is going to need such extraordinary turnout. I liken it to Obama plus in terms of the kind of, and we know it's going to be, even with vote by mail, it's going to be a challenge. Mm-hmm. And so part of our argument was that a Black woman can help electorally in a number of key states. And we, talked about some of the data that shows the impact of Black women and the Black vote. Obviously, the Black vote was very critical in the primary for Joe Biden, but also in helping him to expand the electorate. I think there's also I believe that a Black woman representing the future also would be helpful with younger voters who, because one of the things we're seeing, people, they like Joe Biden. Some of the younger voters don't know as much about him. They want to change, but it's another way to say this is about the future, because we always talk about that in elections, and to point to the future and the future of what this country's leadership will in fact look like, and to lift the voices of Black people. And if you think about that in the aftermath of George Floyd, I think this is a historic moment where, to my mind, the question is, how could you not select a Black woman? And that is as much for a political electoral perspective as anything else.
So let's go there. So there have been a number of women who have who've been talked about. The Vice President Biden said, I think it was yesterday, that his short list will include a number of women of color, for sure. Mm-hmm. There's at least one Latina, I think, still on the list. I believe one Asian AAPI candidate or a potential candidate on the list.
Yeah.
And I'm curious, Karen, what you think of the current crop, and if there are any that stand out, or if you don't want to mention names, talk a little bit about the sort of the qualities that he needs that are represented by the field.
Happy to. And, this is something that I think is really important as we think about this in 2020. I mean, we are, the traditional model and standard for how we think of, who the VP should be. That is a very white male constructed, sort of cookie cutter approach. And I, to his credit, I think the vice president this time around is not doing that. I mean, by saying, I want a woman, considering women of color. And I say that because, all of these women who've been mentioned are extremely qualified. They may not have the kinds of qualifications. I mean, you and I have been in those rooms where there's a list and you're ticking off the list of the military service or, the things they bring that are different. Each of these women has unique experiences at multiple levels of government. And going off of something Patti said, if you think about where the country's going to be in January of 2021, COVID, health, so many systemic inequalities and issues to deal with. And having someone who maybe that person is someone who has strong relationships in Washington, because certainly we know that the president's going to have to get a lot done with Capitol Hill. Maybe that person is also someone who has served at other levels of government in a state where they bring a knowledge, because one of the challenges we're facing right now is that governors and mayors are feeling very much left on their own by the federal government. So maybe part of the way to think about qualifications is who can take that piece on. So part of it is I think for Biden to be thinking about what role does he want this person to play, and I think I would argue that any of these women could do a phenomenal job. I know we have Patti back, so I don't know if we wanted to see if Patti wanted to weigh in.
I have an internet problem.
Yeah, I just want to see if you wanted to weigh in on, the VP qualifications and the people.
Yeah, well, I want to, because Mo kind of blew past it just a little bit. I want to just take a little time to pause and say what a big frickin' deal it is that Joe Biden has already committed to nominating a woman. I mean, I don't think we should take that for granted. I think that is a big, big deal because, both Karen and I, and Mo as well, we spent a major part of our career trying to elect a president to the highest office in the land, and we have fallen short time and time again. And if Joe Biden should win, we are gonna, cross one more hurdle to that, as Hillary Clinton likes to say, that greatest glass ceiling of all time. And I think that's really important, and I'm really grateful, and I just think it's a big deal, but it's also politically smart. I mean, Joe Biden, Democrats need women in large numbers in order to win this election. And so I think it's not only a big deal for little girls everywhere and little boys everywhere, but I think it's politically smart, and it gives him an upper leg. I think in terms of, I agree with Karen. I'm just going to be more politically cutthroat about this. African Americans brought Joe Biden back from the dead, basically, in the nominating process. And I think that there is an enormous amount of political pressure for him to pick an African American running mate. I think, Karen, I think you and I were both on CNN on Super Tuesday, where we saw him basically run the tables without having spent any money in these states, without having any real presence in these states, without having really set foot in some of these states. And it was because African Americans came out in droves and said, we're for Joe. Yeah. And so I think as he makes this decision, he needs to think long and hard about that.
There's some people out there who say, so what I'm taking from this conversation is that it needs to be a woman of color, maybe even specifically an African American woman.
Yes.
Yes.
There are people out there who say, for example, so there are a number of qualified African American women in this field, right? The ones that people talk about the most commonly are Senator Harris, Congresswoman Val Deming from Florida, Mayor Keisha Lance Bottoms from Atlanta, Stacey Abrams. One name, though, is not African American that people talk about is Elizabeth Warren, and that she would bring a lot to the table in helping him reach out to skeptical progressives. But listening to the two of you, it sounds to me like you don't think she's the right choice. Does he run a risk of alienating some parts of the party with whatever choice he makes?
Well, of course, you always do, right? You're never going to please everybody. And in this instance, given the role that Black voters played in bringing Joe Biden back to life, but also that we are, I think for a lot of us, we're so tired. I hate the phrase backbone. I'm like, treat me like a swing voter, because then you'll spend money to court my vote. You'll show up and ask me for my vote, which my old boss, Howard Dean, used to say, that's a sign of respect to show up and ask people for their votes. There is a feeling in this moment, and this is not anything negative against, I'm a big fan of Michelle Lujan Grisham, the governor of New Mexico, who is one of the women on the list. I'm a big fan of Elizabeth Warren's. I think there are a number of these women would bring a lot to the table, but if not now, when? We cannot keep trying to say to Black voters, we need you, we love you, and then not deliver. And so I think in this, yes, it may, but any selection somebody is not going to be happy. I would hope that progressives would, at one point, I worked for Stacey Abrams in 2018. At one point, progressive says she wasn't progressive enough. So, I don't really buy that. And I think progressive voters should understand, I would hope, and identify a Black woman as an important part of the progress that we need to see in this country, in terms of lifting up the voices and the very real lived experience of Black people in this country. Having your knee on someone's neck, that happens more often in this country than it should. And the I can't breathe is a rallying cry for a whole host of experiences that Black and brown and poor people have in this country. So someone who has part of that lived experience, I just think that is incredibly important in this moment, which should not take away from any of the other women.
I think every choice comes with its own political calculations and political additives, and then political detractions. I'm a huge fan of Elizabeth Warren. But you sort of touched upon, general elections are a choice, right? And in November, the choice is going to be between Joe Biden and whoever his running mate is, and Donald Trump and Mike Pence. And look, I firmly believe that when faced with this choice, we're seeing it in polls now. And I know I said that out loud, and we're not supposed to say it out loud, but right now, Joe Biden is doing very, very well. Given Trump's response to the two greatest challenges of his administration, the pandemic and the civil unrest across our country, he has failed. So yes, you can say Elizabeth Warren, she's gonna, she's an olive branch to the progressive wing of the party, maybe she'll get us 1 point or 2 points, but I don't think it's about that this time. I think it's about bringing our country back from a very, very dark place. And to do that, Joe Biden needs to pick someone who can help us move that country back. I'm not saying Elizabeth Warren can't do that, but I think there are other calculations that Joe Biden needs to consider in this moment.
Okay. All right, we're going to start moving to the student questions now. So when I call on you, please introduce yourself, tell us who you are, your school, your year at Georgetown or your Georgetown affiliation, and where you're zooming in from. So with that, let's start with, is it Hamal?
Yep.
Okay, great.
Hi, Mo. Hi, I'm Karen Patti. I'm a Georgetown graduate. I will not tell you the year because it's closer to Mo's time frame than some of the younger folks. I have a question about the announcement that will come out when Biden picks his candidate. And the question is tied to what I think is a big disparity in the digital footprint between the Biden campaign and Trump's. I just checked before this Zoom call. Last count, Trump has almost 83 million Twitter followers, and Biden has 6.3. And usually these announcements have a lot of momentum after they're made in terms of a candidate going out, having physical rallies and bringing lots of people together. In this situation, what would your advice be to Biden to get the maximum splash for the announcement, given the physical limitations that we have in light of COVID?
That's a very, very good question. And the limitations are not just affecting Joe Biden, but they're affecting every politician across the country in every race, House, Senate, governor, like every race. And, they're profound. I mean, the reason Trump has so many more followers is because he had a running head start to Biden. So I'll tell you what we did in 2008. For whatever reason, I still don't know why, but secrecy is valued very highly in the unveiling of your running mate. Truly, like it was like they were going to shoot me if I said anything, even to my husband or to my kids. So the big reveal gets you momentum in and of itself, because those weeks leading up to the reveal of who your VP nominee, everybody's talking about it. It's on everybody's list. Every news organization, every media outlet is doing who's it going to be stories. So the big unveil automatically gets you sort of wall to wall coverage, right? And then the shot of the two of them together for the first time, it gets you wall-to-wall coverage. I would do, given the pandemic, the limitations that the pandemic has given us, and I would love Karen's advice on this because she's a communications expert and a media expert. I'm much more of a manager, but I would do every possible show that you can do, not just with the VP himself, but with all of the surrogates from the campaign that have been built up, just scatter them everywhere. In 2008, we also had Biden do his announcement. He did a series of interviews, and then he went on the trail for a week and a half doing each local market that he was in by himself. And then Obama did separate markets. And then the two potential first and second ladies also did markets. So we blanketed the country, and I think they can still do that, but do it in a virtual way. And that's how I would do it. But I defer to Karen on this one. She's the expert.
Okay. I think, I would do, I tend to think the basement strategy that Biden has been employing is working, in part because in this moment, people want to see calm leadership, and we haven't exactly been seeing that. Certainly that period where President Trump was doing the daily briefings. So I would do, some kind of announcement. They could probably do something in Biden's backyard to make it look a little different than the basement. But then I would try, I would go to an old tactic that we used to do, which is I would do satellite media tour. I would make sure you're hitting local markets in key states. Because I'm a firm believer you can never give enough love, because that is, at the end of the day, people watch their local evening news. So you want to get to that, and where they have newspapers, you want to make sure you've given them something. And then I would look at, certainly you would want to have your surrogates ready to go, and I would have digital surrogates ready to go, so that as the rollout happens, you've got people online generating conversation and enthusiasm. As much as it's not, it's an imperfect way to judge, enthusiasm and momentum, people still use it. That's reality. So the more you can add to that, I think the better, and sort of have your, digital team ready to go. And also you want to be saturating with different, what's your narrative about the person and what the two want to do together, and be, really blanketing with that. I also think there's no reason not to still do the classic. The kind of gold standard was to do a 60-minute sit-down interview with the two. I would do that. I think the challenge the last thing I'll say is, the big challenge now is because of social media, things get out so fast. In 2016, I left the headquarters. I thought I had like 3 hours before they were going to announce. And I left headquarters to go get something to eat. And it was out. Somebody had it. It was, on Twitter, and everything exploded before we were even, luckily we had our plan in place and we were ready, and we just moved up the timeline to implement it. But certainly you have to be prepared. And I think, as Patti said, I would just be very creative in thinking about, I would have pre-cut videos that you could, feed into certain platforms, so that everybody, you blanket it and everybody feels like they got something in the format that their platform most needs it.
Right.
All right. Thanks for the question. Let's go to Julia next. Julia, you're up.
Thanks so much. Thank you so much for speaking with us today. I'm Julia Skeen, and I'm a rising junior in the college at Georgetown, and I'm calling in from Norfolk, Virginia. And I know we've spoken some about kind of the question of whether, we should elect a woman of color, and especially with Amy Klobuchar withdrawing and kind of calling for a woman of color to be picked as the vice president. I kind of was wondering about your own personal insights into whether or not you think there is, responsibility for Joe Biden and the Democratic Party to choose a woman of color as the nominee, especially considering the context of, recent events and the Black Lives Matter movement kind of expanding and being so relevant in this moment.
Yeah, I'll just, reiterate something I said, which is, I think if you look at the country as it is and the direction of this country, and certainly when Joe Biden was so prescient, because he started out talking about healing the soul of this country, and boy, and people made fun of him for that. And it was so right on, because that is at the heart of it. What's at stake, I think a lot of us feel and see. And certainly if you think about the events of the last couple of months, that has, I think, been dramatically playing itself out on our streets all across this country, that we need to heal and come together. And so, yes, I think there's a responsibility, because as I mentioned, I think a lot of Black voters have felt at times that the progressive movement isn't always aligned with the Black movement and Black issues, and that sometimes the progressive movement can be just as guilty as others to say, well, wait your turn. And I think this moment is culminating. I mean, also, if you think about COVID, who got hit the hardest? Black and brown Americans and low-income people. So many underpinnings of systemic inequalities have been exposed in the last 6-8 months. We always knew they were there, but I think they've exploded in so many ways onto, the front pages and where it's the top of conversation. And, I think a Black woman represents the future. A woman of color represents, the truth is we're going to be a majority minority country. Part of what 2016 was about was people who felt uncomfortable with that. And I think, I hope that in the last 4 years, people have gotten more comfortable. I certainly think, as Patti said, all hats off to Biden for saying he would pick a woman, because I think it represents a statement that we're ready for that. And I think it is part of, in an ideal world, part of the purpose of our movements are to push the envelope a bit and to push the country, forward a bit. So I am proud of the Democratic Party for supporting women and women of color up and down the ticket.
Yep, what Karen said. The only way it is not going to be remarkable anymore to elect a woman or a person of color or, a Black woman, a Hispanic woman, is to do it. And one of the ways to do it is by nominating someone, and Joe Biden has that ability, right? This person doesn't have to go through the primary season the way Joe Biden did. He actually has the power to appoint someone his running mate. And if he wins, that person will be elected too. And that's an awesome power. And given where we are in this country and in this moment, I think it would be a dereliction of duty not to have a person of color as his running mate, period.
Thanks, Julia. Okay, Kelvin, you're up. And remember to introduce yourselves.
So first, I just want to say thanks for coming here and talking to us. It's been really insightful so far. My name is Kelvin Dale. I'm a rising sophomore in the college, and I'm zooming in from Houston, Texas. And my real quick question for you, have there ever been any instances of a surprise concerning the background of a running mate despite the vetting process?
Well, Sarah Palin.
Yeah.
She was completely unqualified, and I think they did not do a sufficient vet. They weren't prepared for just how unqualified she was, and it was shocking to not just the team, but to every voter in America, I think.
Yeah, I can remember sitting at the Democratic Party headquarters watching her speech at the Republican convention, and we were all like, oh shit, because she delivered that speech so well. So we thought, oh my God, we're really in trouble here.
Right.
And then the next day or so, once she was out on the stump actually talking, it immediately was clear that they had not done, as Patti said, either the full vet, or maybe they thought they could control her and they didn't really understand who they had with Sarah Palin. And we were like, wow, imagine 2 nights ago we were nervous, and now we're like, we got this. We felt like she definitely helped the Democratic Party's cause. I'll put it that way.
I would think, there hasn't been a big blockbuster, we didn't catch something vet since maybe 72 with Thomas Eagleton, right?
Right.
And he was the running mate, and then came out that he was undergoing, electroshock therapy, as they called it then, and they ended up withdrawing his selection.
Yeah. Look, the closest I can think of would maybe be in 2008 when the John Edwards story exploded. He was, I think most people thought, in contention for something, unclear, some kind of a role, and that that was a complete collapse of his political career right there.
Yeah.
The only other thing, it's not so much surprises with the vets of the actual VP candidate, but sometimes people around him, or her, people around him or her, people on their staff formally or, tangentially, things pop up and we're like, oh my God, but usually these vetters are very, very good.
Yeah.
Yes.
All right, let's try to get a couple more questions in. Anna, you're up. Thanks, Kelvin.
My name is Anna Davis. I'm an attorney in Durham, North Carolina, and I'm enrolled in the Georgetown Continuing Studies program in the Human Resources Management degree area specifically. My question is about Elizabeth Warren. Understanding that Massachusetts has a Republican governor, other than what you've said about the importance of an African-American woman as a vice presidential pick, do you think the fact that the loss of a Senate seat in Massachusetts would weigh against her such that she might not be selected? Thank you.
Yes. Yes. I mean, we want to win the presidency, but we really want to win the Senate too. You know, it's if we have the House, which I think we will keep, and then we pick up the Senate and we have the presidency, well then it's just, as you all know, a lot easier to get things done. And so the Senate is of the utmost importance. And I am sure the fact that there's a Republican governor in Massachusetts weighs against her in the selection process.
Sure. It's a very real consideration. The only thing I would add is, you know, I've heard, like I said, I love Michelle Lujan Grisham. Some have said, you know, that was a hard governor seat to take back, because one of the things is, given how important governorships are as a pathway, because of being executive leadership as a pathway to the presidency, even though we've had a lot of senators in the last few years, holding on to that governorship is really important. And so you have to consider, if you pick someone and you might, you know, if it means losing a Senate seat, or it could mean trying to having a special election in a tough seat, you know, next year, that absolutely is part of the consideration.
Okay. All right. Thanks, Anna. Let's go to Mike. Mike, you're up.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for doing this event. My name is Michael Gore. I am a rising junior in the college, and I am from New Jersey. So my question was initially about choosing a vice president that would help bring in progressives. But since you already sort of touched on that, I wanted to address specifically the victories of Black progressives in New York, people like Jamal Bowman, Mondaire Jones, and in Kentucky too, with Charles Booker coming so close to winning the primary that he was just in. What would you say that, or would you say that these victories of Black progressives might influence voting patterns in the fall, and how might picking a Black woman as Joe Biden's vice president, how might that influence voter turnout, especially among younger Black progressives who had previously supported Sanders?
You know, I would hope, having spent some time with the Sanders camp in 2016 around the platform, I would hope that it would encourage people to support the Biden ticket if they haven't already. And one thing I want to give Senator Sanders a lot of credit for, I think this cycle in particular, he has been very clear all along, and I think even more so, you know, since Biden really secured the nomination, that he's going to do everything he can to help make sure we win. And so I hope that, you know, and I assume whoever Biden picks, he would be behind that person. And I certainly hope that would be helpful. But the other thing I would say, and we haven't touched on as much as it is the case that the VP nominee, it really sort of finds themselves in the middle of this presidential campaign with people kind of dictating to them the message. I mean, they still have to tell their story, and that's part of the rollout. So whoever this person is, they're still going to have to be conscientious of, you know, how do we tell this person's story in a way that we know progressives, young progressives of color are looking for, right? That we know in the same way that moderates might be looking for. I mean, that we know women are looking for, and that we know everyone is looking for in terms of making the case that this person could handle the presidency if, God forbid, something happened. So I hope that the Biden campaign is thinking about how do we in addition to having Bernie be helpful, how do we help make the case? Because again, it's important, so many of these constituencies, and being part of a couple of them myself, you want to feel like the argument was made to you, that, that your vote was courted. And that's half the battle right there, is feeling like, I showed up and I made my case to you about why I think this person is the right person.
Patti, you want to add anything? Or?
I really don't have much to add other than those races in New York and Kentucky were amazing. And like, my hat's off. I thought it was great.
Okay. I know we could keep going with a bunch more questions, but sadly we're running out of time. So I want to close by putting you both on the hot seat, because you had to know I was going to, and ask you both, based on everything we've talked about and your own sense of things, to make a prediction, but also to give a shout out to the dark horse that you think people might be overlooking.
I'll go first. I think it's going to be Kamala. I think it needs to be a woman of color. I think it needs to be a Black woman. I think of the candidates out there who we know are on the list, I think she probably, given this moment, has the most experience to really, do the actual hard work of recovery from this pandemic. And I touched upon it earlier, the different aspects that need significant help, whether it's the economy, healthcare, education, transportation. So I think she has the most experience to do that. Dark horse, Tammy Baldwin of Wisconsin. I think Wisconsin is a crucial state. She is very well liked there. I think she can win Wisconsin for us.
Okay. You heard it.
Patti, that's a good one. Well, the dark horse that people keep saying to me, and I keep saying she'll never, ever do it, is Michelle Obama. It's like, okay. And I wish that, Santa Claus was real. I mean, I just don't see her. She is living her best life. I don't think that's going to happen. That would be my dark horse. Because I'm part of this movement that says Black and female, I'm not going to pick one specifically, but just as a strategist, I would say at this moment, it appears Val Demings and Kamala Harris are, and I should say Keisha Lance Bottoms are at the top, seem to be around the top. One thing I will mention about Keisha that I think is really interesting and makes her a little bit of a dark horse is that, people became much more enthusiastic about her as a potential candidate when they saw her in action as the mayor of Atlanta. I mean, the speech that she gave some weeks ago was, I had friends who are not very political from on the other side of the country email me and ask me about her and say, I never heard of her before. She's so phenomenal. And I say that to say, times really can reveal a person and their leadership capabilities in ways that vetting just can't catch. And so I certainly, I think Keisha Lance Bottoms is incredibly talented. She's someone we should all watch because I think she is certainly destined for bigger things. And I that's why I see her, if there's a dark horse, maybe she's kind of more seriously one, because again, I think America got a totally different view of her as a leader than they might have otherwise, just from, what we would read on paper about her. So.
Well, Patti and Karen, you are both brilliant political strategists that I know folks at the Biden campaign take seriously. And so if any of them are tuning in, they're probably sharing their notes with the rest of the team now. More importantly to me, you are both good friends. And so I want to thank you both for taking time out of your busy schedules. We'll circle back with you after the decision's made and see even more brilliant or if they prove us all fools. So thank you both. And to everyone that tuned in tonight here in Zoom, or those of you following on our social media channels, I want to thank you for spending part of your evening with us. Please continue to follow us at GU Politics. We've got a few big events that we just locked down this summer, but I can't tell you who yet. So make sure you follow along online or sign up for our newsletter to find out. So thank you all very much, and we'll see you soon.